All righty, guys. Thank you all for bearing with me. I apologize. I messed up the time today. Little time zone issue that I wasn't paying attention to. So thank y'all for bearing with me. I appreciate it. But y'all have come to greatly, and I appreciate it. Come to bear with me on my time zone issues because we've got so many vets and so many different time zones to cover. But I'm very excited because we're gonna have this is part one, and then I need to make that in the title. But this is going to be part one of our visit with this guest. This is Captain Bill Collier. He served with the Marine Corps as a H-34, what would be better known to our SOG men and those of you that listen to the SOG interviews, the King Bee. And he wrote a book about his tour with the Marine Corps, and it is linked in the show notes, as well as his other two books, and I'll show you in just a second. But that is actually a H-34 landing on a scary, scary piece of land called the rock pile, and we will hear about that today, speaking to the captain. But also, while we're speaking of his books, I wanted to go ahead and show we will have him back the 30th of this month to close out the month to talk about this book and his tour with Air America. It is Air America, a CIA super pilot spills the beans, flying helicopters in Laos for Air America, Captain Bill Collier. So I'm very excited not only for today, but also for us to get into this. It's going to be a great, great interview for both of them. And before I talk us all to death, I'm going to hand it over to Mr. Bill and let him give a bio on himself, and we'll get into some questions and whatever comes up. Mr. Bill, thanks for joining us, and the floor is yours, sir.
All right. Thank you very much, Bud.
Absolutely.
Appreciate you putting all this together. I've been having a lot of fun writing my books, and it's been very therapeutic for me. I suffer from a bad case of post-traumatic stress. If you read my books, you'll understand why. Facing death down every day for months. And I came back to the States, and I was kind of a mess, and I couldn't commit. I couldn't stay in one place, and I couldn't stay in one relationship, and I couldn't stay in one job. So I kept bouncing around like a ping pong ball in a fan factory. And but I finally got some help through the VA. And if your life isn't working for you, it's kind of late now maybe, but if your life isn't working real good for you, then you might want to check with the VA and get into, VA has free counseling. And I also got into a group therapy situation where I got to sit around, and guess what? I got to sit around with a bunch of guys, excuse me, who had very similar situations. They had post-traumatic stress. They had been dysfunctional ever since Vietnam. And none of the others were pilots, but it didn't matter. The same problem affected everybody. And to sit down and realize, hey, I'm not the only one whose life's a mess. I'm not the only one who has nightmares and trauma and can't sleep and all kinds of stuff because of the trauma. And it's really, really good to connect with other guys. I'm still good friends with several of the guys that I got into group therapy with in 1994. So we keep in touch and we communicate and help each other out. So it's really, really reaching out to your buddies. Even though they're not your buddies right now, they will be soon. So reach out to the VA. The VA has free, as I said, free, F-R-E-E, free counseling. That's what saved my life. Literally, I would probably most likely be dead by now if I hadn't gotten counseling and got my life back together.
Wow.
But so to start with, I just a small town kid from the wine country, Sonoma of California, about an hour north of San Francisco, and I finished pretty good in high school. Went to the local junior college, what we call junior is now called community college in Napa, and I got 2.5 years, and I was a pre-engineering student. And my brother, who had been in the Air Force already in and out by the time I joined up, said, Bill, if you want to go in the military, you want to be an officer. It's a much better deal to be an officer. So I thought about that, and I said, okay, well, to be an officer, I have to have a college degree. So that's why I started the junior college. And after 4 semesters at the quad, one day there was this funny fellow in a funny green uniform with gold wings on his chest, and he had a pulled out mock-up display of the cockpit of a T-34 training airplane. Small little guy, not much bigger than a Cessna 150. And he said, you know, the Marine Corps now has an aviation cadet program. If you have 2 years of college, you can go directly to Navy flight school. Well, I wasn't too interested I just didn't think I had the ability or the desire to be a pilot. But then he got me with a hook that really got me. He says, you know, if you go to flight school and you finish, you get a commission as a second lieutenant. Well, cool. I wanted to be an officer. There's my way of going in and becoming an officer without having a 4-year degree. So I jumped on it. And by gosh, I found out I really had the aptitude for flying. I really enjoyed flying. I really loved flying. And I did it until 1996, so 32 years, almost all in helicopters. So off I went to Navy flight school. Believe it or not, the Navy had this, and the Marine Corps had this aviation cadet program. We could go directly to flight school. We did not go to boot camp. We did not go to officers cadet school. Did not go to platoon leadership school in the Marine Corps, any of that. I went directly into flight school. We had a little mini 10-day boot camp in Pensacola before we started learning about flying, but it was nothing compared to what the real boot camp was like. Some of the kids in my class had actually been through boot camp, and they didn't have a college degree at all, but they had done well on the aptitude tests and the interest tests. So they got selected for the cadet program too with no college. So and they had been through boot camp, and they scoffed at what we were doing in flight schools the first 10 days, because it was such a joke compared to what they had done in real boot camp. But I never had any regrets. Everything I've ever heard, boot camp sounded challenging. I knew I could have done it. But then we went into academics and learning all about engines and electrical systems and aerodynamics and military stuff. And then we learned to march and drill and do our rifles and rifle drill and all that jazz. So I did learn all that stuff, how to march and then eventually after 16 weeks, then we went over to a new base and actually began to fly that T-34 that I talked about earlier. That was the primary phase of flight school. And from there, I went over to another base called Whiting North, about an hour north of Pensacola. And there I began to fly the T-28 fighter bomber. And I did that for a whole year, almost all of 65. And I learned to do just basic flying, and I learned basic instruments. I learned formation flying. I learned night flying. I learned night formation flying. No, I don't think I really did night formation flying, actually, no. We were in the same sky, but we were separated. And then I did radio instrument training, which was very challenging. In fact, I made a note to myself at that time, if I could pass this radio instrument flying in the sky in the clouds at night, I'm just going to drop out of flight school. I'm going to go back to college and be a brain surgeon, because if I can do this, I could do that. As it turned out, I stuck with it and stayed there, finished flight school. And in September of 65, I got to land one of those T-28 fighter bombers, the Charlie model, that had a tailhook. Got to land it on the aircraft carrier Lexington 8 times, which was what eventually got me my actual gold wings, which I've since had made into a ring. And wow. So I earned my gold wings on that day when I landed on the carrier, but I didn't actually get my gold wings or my commission until mid-December of 65. Because after landing on the carrier, then I went to helicopter school and I learned to fly the H-34. And after learning to fly the H-34, then I went to the air base called New River right next to Camp Lejeune. And there I did combat training. And I flew with guys that actually flown in Vietnam already. And I'm talking here early 66 now. I had Christmas leave at home, fortunately. And after I'd been in North Carolina for 6 months, I got orders for Vietnam. And I'm glad, because North Carolina, that base near Camp Lejeune, really sucked. I was glad to get out of that base and to go to Vietnam. and I was assigned to Squadron 161, Helicopter Medium Marine, HMM 161 at Fubai in late 66. And that's where I began flying as a co-pilot. Nobody gets thrown into flying as an aircraft commander without lots and lots of co-pilot time to learn the ropes, which I did very well. And then our squadron went to Okinawa. We were supposed to be there 3 or 4 months. It was a good break, but something happened while we were there that the powers that be decided that our squadron should be broken up and these flags sent back to the States so they could reform and flying the new replacement for the H-34, the H-46, the Sea Knight for the Army guys, a smaller version of the Chinook. It was a good machine until it wasn't. But then I went to Vietnam and I flew. And then after in Okinawa, when they sent the flag back to the States, then I had to go back to Vietnam and I was assigned to a new squadron, HMM 363, which was based at the little peninsula next to Chulai called Keokee. And I was based there for about a month only. And then we went aboard ship for a while and did ship operations. And then we went on a cruise sort of. We went to Taiwan and we went to the Okinawa again. And we went to Subic Bay for a while. And so I got to spend, I think, about 6 weeks aboard ship before we came back to Vietnam. Interesting thing happened while we were in Vietnam. In Subic Bay in the Philippines. There were lots of bars and there were lots of bar girls and they were fun to drink and dance with and play with. And as we were leaving, all the bar girls said, "Oh, we know where you're going." They asked us where we're going. We say, "We don't know." They say, "Oh, we know where you're going. You're going to Quang Ngai." Well, where's Quang Ngai? Well, that's the northern part of the southernmost province from the DMZ, just south of Quang Tri province. And the girls in the bars knew where we were going. We didn't. So when we sailed back for Vietnam, we had a big secret brief in the ready room on the ship. And the skipper told us where we were going. Well, how did the bar girls know? Because we had asked him before and his CO where we were going, and they didn't know. Now suddenly we're aboard ship, and now we know we're going where the bar girls said we were going to. So this is pretty scary for me. I didn't want to fly into an ambush. I didn't want to give up my wings, so I thought, well, how can I honorably get out of flying on this next operation in Quang Ngai? So the opportunity came up because while we were in the Philippines, 2 of the officers from the battalion that we had aboard the ship went into the village and disappeared. They deserted, I guess, or were killed or eaten or buried. Who knows what happened to them? I imagine they turned up later. But they were short 2 forward air controllers, and the Grunt Battalion asked for volunteers to be forward air controllers. So I volunteered so I could be on the ground surrounded by grunts instead of flying into an ambush the way I saw it. So they put me aboard a helicopter and flew me over to the landing dock, LPD, I think it's called, landing platform dock. It had helicopter pads on top, but it had a great big barn doors in the aft end of the ship, and inside that they would drive the landing craft that would hit the beach. So this was one of my fun adventures because I was aboard ship the night before, and I was living in this room with all the junior officers of the battalion. And they asked me, did I want to go to a movie? They were all going to go. And I said, no, I think I'll stay here and write some letters. Well, my plan was, because I didn't even know how to pack my pack for going into the field. So all the other junior officers went to a movie. I took one of their packs that looked official and I unpacked it and saw how he packed it. And I repacked my pack to look like his. So then I was ready to hit the field. And they gave me my choice of weapons. So I decided I needed to have a 45 caliber grease gun, submachine gun that shot 45 bullets, same as my 45 sidearm. So I was loaded for bear. And so I William went down into the bowels of the ship about 6 a.m, maybe 5 o'clock in the morning, really early. We all got into this landing craft. And then finally, after about an hour or so, they finally got everything ready and they opened the big doors and they flooded the bay. And the landing craft went down the ramp, clang, 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 into the water and started bobbing around like a cork. And then we went out and we were going to hit the beach at first light, right? That was the plan. So then we get down there And we circle beside the ship, circle, 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 going round and round and round. Because I was the officer of this group of platoon, I think, of guys. I was the last person to board. There was no place for me to sit. I had to stand right at the open hatch, semi-crouched, semi-standing. It was very awkward. I could lean against the wall, but I had no seat and I couldn't stand up thoroughly. And every time we'd hit a little rough wave, water would come down the hatch and go down my neck. So I got soaked in salt water. And then we're bouncing around and we're in this closed environment. And guys are puking in their helmets. And I could smell all the vomit because I was where all this air was going up through the hatch and I was smelling it all. Somehow I managed not to vomit myself, but we bobbed around for over an hour. Finally, 9 o'clock. This is not first light. 9 o'clock, we finally make it to the beach. And as we're just about to hit on the beach, the gunner on top of the landing craft opens fire with his .50 caliber machine gun, shooting at something on the beach. And I'm saying, holy shit, we're shooting at somebody. We're shooting at them. They got to be shooting back. When that big door comes down, we're all going to die because we're just sitting ducks inside this can. Damn, I was scared. So finally we hit the beach and the machine crawled up on the beach and the big door went down. We all ran out and surprise, surprise, no shooting. The gunner on top was just shooting for the fun of it for practice. And all the Marines were standing around in bunches, consulting their maps and just BSing. Well, that was totally contrary to everything I ever learned. You never stand around in groups in combat because one grenade will get you all. But they were there, and so I joined in. We talked for a while, and then we started patrolling. I spent 13 days out in the field with the grunts, and I got to avoid flying in this particular incident. And during my time on the ground, I was almost killed 5 or 6 times by short rounds, short bombs, short mortar rounds, snipers. A burst of AK-47 went right through a helicopter. I guided in. I decided my squadron helicopter came in to pick up some wounded guys from the short rounds. And just to be a hot dog and do a John Wayne maneuver, as soon as one of my majors in my squadron landed right in front of me, just for fun, I jumped into the ditch like I was playing John Wayne. And just as I did, a whole burst of AK-47 fire went right through the nose of the helicopter, impacted in the ditch right above my head. Had I not jumped to the ditch, I would have been badly shot, probably killed. So that was as close as I came to getting killed, I think. But it was quite an adventure. And after 13 days, it was only 13 days in the field with the grunts, I decided my place was back in the cockpit. I did not want to be in the ground anymore. And I was promised I would not have to stay in the field, and my CO made that promise true. So I went back to flying. And so at that time, we sailed around on ship for a little while. And then we offloaded at Dong Ha, which is in the northern part of I Corps, just south of the demilitarized zone. And that's where we were based for about the next 5 or 6 months. It was a good base. They built us good hooches. We had a good mess hall. We had an officers club, and it was quite comfortable. But we did all the flying, all the areas up in the northern part of the DMZ called Jilin and Kantian. We worked those areas, and then out to the rock pile, which is on the cover of my book. And then we did out to Quezon. And while we were at Quezon, we supported the troops, the grunts, out on all the hillsides surrounding that base. In early 67 and late 66, Quezon was really quiet. It was so quiet that there were elephants grazing in the grass off the end of the runway. And we would even take off our bulletproof vests because we feel nobody got shot at in this area. We didn't feel the need to wear our bulletproof vests. It was more comfortable without them. Sometimes we didn't even carry our pistols. So, but it got much, much worse after that. And the hill battles of 881, 861, and 950, and the siege of Quezon altogether, I missed that siege part, but some of my squadron mates were still there at the time. And it was hard flying because everything that flew into Quezon got shot up. So anyway, we worked around Dong Ha. I was able to find some squadron reports of our squadron diary for the time I was there. And I did the numbers and I calculated that during my time in Vietnam, I just did proportions, my proportion of flight time to a portion per proportion of the Medevacs hauled each month, and I determined I hauled about 600 wounded Marines out of the field during my 11 months of flying in Vietnam. And I feel really good about that. As far as I know, I never had to kill anybody. I never had to shoot anybody, even when I was out with the grunts. My machine guns in my helicopter did return fire a few times. There's no telling what the gunners may or may not have hit. Mostly, we didn't go out looking for trouble. We didn't go out looking for battle or fight. Our machine guns were just to shoot at people when they shot at us. So they would duck down so we could do our job. And that seemed to work. So a lot of times we'd go out to resupply the Marines. We would carry always food and water and ammunition and mortars and such to the grunts in the field, because especially if they'd had any activity with the enemy, any enemy activity, and they'd been using their arms, they get really thirsty. If you've ever been in real busy time and you're out there humping it and the wheel, you get really thirsty really fast. So we always made it a point bringing lots of water out to the guys, and food and ammunition. And today, every time we'd land, we'd dump out all the stuff we brought, and we'd always pick up whatever wounded they might have. Sometimes it would only be 2 or 3. Sometimes it'd be 6 or 8, depending on the situation and the circumstances and how much fuel we had on board. But the temperature, the humidity, and temperature in Vietnam took a lot of the efficiency away from our rotor systems and from our piston engine. We had the last major piston engine in any helicopter for combat for military. The H-34 had a big Wright 1820 84 Alpha radial 9-cylinder engine. Same engine modified in the B-17, the T-2, the S-2, the T-28, and a bunch of other aircraft had the same engine. And it was supercharged, so we had 1,525 horsepower out of it. But we used it hard. We played them hard, and we used them up. They only were good for 600 hours, and they had to be changed out. Because I calculated also from my unit diary that I made 11,000 landings while I was in Vietnam. So we'd start off seeing the staging area beside the airport. We'd load up with supplies for, say, 3 different platoons out in the field. So we'd have 3 bundles of cargo. So I'd fly out. First off, we'd have to hop over to the staging area. Then we'd hop out to the field. We'd land up first platoon, second platoon, third platoon. Every time we dump something out and or pick up wounded, then we'd go back to the hospital pad and drop off the wounded. Then we'd hop over to the fuel pads and get more fuel, hot refueling. Then we go back over to the airport to get another load. So there's 5 or 6 landings right there. And that was just one sortie. So and from that, I ended up getting 24 air medals. And I got a Purple Heart for a minor wound, and I got a Navy Commendation Medal with a Combat V for my time in the field with the grunts. So, and then I got the usual I've been there medals, which, look good on my chest. So the one I'm proudest of is the air medals, because that's what I did was rescuing wounded Marines mostly. And the other missions that we did were, night medevac. Sometimes we did day medevac. Sometimes we did night medevac. That was always the scariest mission. I've got a couple of good stories about that in a minute. And then we did recon overflies, and we did leaflet droplets, where we threw out the Chuhoi leaflets for the enemies, so to tell them if they surrendered to be treated well and paid well. I don't know if anybody ever did that. I think a few did. And then we did external load work. It was a fast way to move stuff by putting a net under the helicopter instead of like on this book. You can see the water bubble underneath the Huey there. We deliver all kinds of stuff with the external load net, so it was much, much faster and more efficient and safer, because they could hook a load of stuff on. We could fly it out. As soon as we got in the zone, as soon as the load was close to touching down or touched down, we could just press a button and release the load and be gone. So we didn't have to stop and land and unload and reload and take off again. Of course, in this case, we didn't pick up any medevacs, or sometimes we might land beside the load and pick up medevacs. And overall, it was quite challenging. On one of my very first trips to Quezon, I was wandering around. I had a little break, and I encountered this great big snake that was dead. was about 9 feet long and about 6 inches in diameter, solid black. And it was dead, and it was beginning to stink from rot. But I was curious. I said to the Marines, "Hey, what's the story on this snake?" And they said, "Well, the recon Marines were out on patrol somewhere nearby in the jungle, and they encountered the snake, and they decided they would capture it and make it their mascot." So they did. I don't know how they got it back to the base. They must have put it in a backpack and tied it in or whatever. Brought it back to the base, and they put it in a foxhole, and they put wire mesh over the foxhole and put sandbags around the wire mesh so the snake couldn't get out. And they put up a sign that said, "Beware of the snake." There's the snake. That's me too, believe it or not. 23 years old. 22 maybe at that point. And so they put up the sign, "Beware of the snake," and they watched, and nothing was happening. So they had a pet. They had a mascot. After 3 or 4 days, they realized, well, we have this pet. We got to feed it. It needs food. So they went to the village, the Montagnard village nearby at Lang Bay, and they bought 2 ducks from the villagers. And they brought the ducks back to the foxhole, and they lifted the wire up, and they threw the ducks in there and put the lid down, put the sandbags around. And that was food for the snake. Well, the snake ignored the ducks, and the ducks stayed in the other end of the hole, and they ignored each other for first. So they said, okay, well, the snake must not be hungry right now. Later that night, there was lots of noise, a lot of thrashing and quacking and hissing and noise out there in the foxhole. And the grunt said, "Oh, good, the snake has fed. It won't be hungry anymore. We've taken care of our pet." So they went out the next morning to look at the snake, and it was dead. The ducks had pecked its eyes out and killed it and protected themselves. So that was too bad. Their mascot was dead. So they took it out and threw it out, but they kept the ducks, and they put up a new sign that said, "Beware of the ducks." I got a first prize in a writing contest for short humor for that. That's great. I submit it whenever I can. So it wasn't all awful combat. There was some delightful stuff that happened. Mostly getting together with my buddies every night and getting drunk. That was our primary activity every night in the officers' club. We did have beds, and we had hooches, and we had showers. I'd get a shower every night if I had the energy. Sometimes I didn't. And we had pretty adequate food. It wasn't bad at all. And so my night medevac stories, actually medevac itself was kind of scary because you're going into places where there were wounded. The reason they were wounded was because usually they'd been shot. That meant they were having a confrontation with the enemy, and they were shooting the enemy, and the enemy was shooting back. So it was always a little dicey going into a medevac. And sometimes when the grunts were surrounded, it was really dicey because we had to get ammunition and water into them or they were going to die because they were surrounded. They were running out of ammunition. They had to have food. They needed food and they needed water. So we'd go in. That's the times we go in with machine guns blazing, going in and going out. Amazingly enough, I only took 1 hit in my whole tour in Vietnam. I have no idea why I was so lucky, but that was a very simple blade and hit my blade and no other damage, no one hurt. But night medevac was a whole different story because we had to go out and land in the mountains in the dark in a landing zone that was not perfect and without good light. So the first night on this first mission I'm talking about, we're talking late September of 66, out of Dong Ha. This is before. Yeah, we were working out of Phu Bai. We'd come up and work out of Dong Ha and work in Khe Sanh area before I got based there permanently in 67. Anyway, we went out on this night medevac. There's this place called Mutter Ridge, Mutter, Mutter Ridge. And the North Vietnamese held the high ground, and the Marines are doing their Marine thing, trying to trek the hill, right? That's what Marines do or die. And they were dying. So we got a call for an emergency medevac. A Marine was dying and needed to be carried out of the field right now. I was flying co-pilot with a very senior first lieutenant, and I'm sorry to say, I don't remember who he was. And I can't find it in the records because I need to write that guy up for at least a Silver Star, if not a Medal of Honor. It's probably too late now. But we flew out to the zone and we talked to the grunts on the way. On the radio, we transferred over to their frequency and we're talking to them. And it was going to be dicey, we could tell, because we could hear shooting in the background. And the radio operator was huffing and puffing because he's moving positions, trying to get to a safer place to give us guidance. But he guided us in, and we could tell where it was. And as we're going down, the aircraft commander told me to turn off all of our exterior lights so we wouldn't be visible to the enemy. That was a good idea. I liked it a lot. So I did. I reached up on the instrument panel between us and overhead and turned off all the external lights. And so then we get in and we're hovering over the landing zone, but there's no landing zone. It's only a battle zone. And we're hovering over 90-foot trees. And so the crew chief had the cable already partly unwound. And as soon as we got into it and established hover, he threw the cable out and started lowering it down so the Marines down below could put the wounded Marine in the safety basket, the retrieval basket. And so we're hovering there. The problem was there were all hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tracers zigzagging back and forth between us. Red for the Marines and green, the enemy had green tracers. And there's like this geometric plane being defined by tracers. The problem with it was all the people shooting each other were on this hillside that was sloped about 40 degrees. And the pilot was trying to hold a hover, but he couldn't do it because he couldn't see the ground and he had no ground reference to hover to. So he kept drifting off, drifting away and drifting uphill and downhill. We didn't want to drift into taller trees above us. We didn't want to drift into the air where the enemy was, which is where the tall trees were. And we had to try to rescue this Marine. So, and once in a while, an air burst of tracers would come up and go right by us, pretty close. But I think mostly it was maybe guys running who fell and just shot their bullets in the air. I don't think they really honestly shot at us. I don't know why. So we're hovering there, and then the aircraft commander, the first lieutenant, says to me, "Bill, do you know where the hover floodlight switch is?" My first thought was, this is really a silly time to be asking me questions about the machine, about procedures, what we would call a NATOPS check. This is weird. Then about a millisecond later, I realized, oh my God, he's asking me to turn those lights on as we're hovering over hundreds of enemy soldiers. If I turn that light on, we're going to die. But I'm a good Marine officer, junior officer. My senior officer tells me to turn on the lights. He says, do it now. I flinch, I grimace, I bear myself because I know when I hit that switch, I'm going to die. I hit the switch, the floodlights come on. Think of a Friday night football game, the standard light standards over a Friday night football game. Here we are that light hovering over a major battle. And damn, who knows why or how, but somehow we didn't get laced full of holes. We hovered there for about 90 seconds till the crew chief was able to raise up the wounded Marine, pull him into the helicopters. We turned off all the lights and flew back to Delta Med, which we called the hospital, which is back by Donghua near Quaintree, actually. And we delivered that wounded Marine to the hospital. We never got any feedback whether he lived or died. We never knew about these guys, if they lived or died. But that was the scariest mission so far. I'd only been in country about 2 months, maybe 2.5, like July, August, September, about 3 months. And I just knew with this kind of shit happening, I was not going to live through my tour. This was really, really scary. About a month later, I think the first incident was August, because I know that's right, it was only 2 months. And then a month later, 3 months into my tour, we got the same mission in the same area, emergency medevac, Mutter Ridge. So I was flying this time with a senior captain named, I forgot his name. Oh, it'll come to me. And so we fly out there. And so this time we're talking to the grunts on the radio again, trying to get direction. And once again, we hear the radio operator huffing and puffing, and we hear shooting in the background. You know, this is going to be a dicey pickup. So we're talking to the guys, and the radio operator says, helicopter, whatever our call sign was, we're not ready for you yet. We need you to orbit and wait a while, then we'll call you in. Captain Jantz, Peter Jantz, was the co-pilot, the pilot I was flying with. Said, okay, we can wait. So we started orbiting. Well, while we're orbiting right exactly halfway between our base and Mutter Ridge, unbeknown to us, the Marines that were going out to help are being overrun by the enemy. And they have decided they're going to call artillery in on themselves, because if they don't, at least they'll know it's coming and they can jump in foxholes. But if the enemy won't know it's coming, and most of the enemy will die, and this might save their lives. Otherwise, they're going to die anyway. So the lieutenant in charge of that platoon or squad or whatever was out there, maybe he was a company commander, I don't know. They called artillery in on themselves. Unfortunately, we were orbiting in the path of the artillery, and we didn't know it because we were off frequency. We didn't hear them. And the guy in charge of quelling the artillery, his name, radio close name was Landshark Charlie, didn't know how to contact us to tell us, hey, we're doing an emergency artillery, get out of the way. So to make a long story short, we flew into the artillery going past us. We were orbiting perpendicular to it. And first thing, my first notice was there was tremendous noise. Think if you were underneath a railroad trestle when a high-speed freight train went over really fast, really making lots of noise with your head right between the trestle tracks. Noisy. And a few seconds later, the rattling noise, the rattling, the whooshing, and then just shaking. As we ran into the turbulence that was behind some rounds or a round of artillery, we flew right through the track of that artillery and hit the turbulence. It shook us like a terrier shaking a rat. Unfortunately for our wingman, he was hit by the next barrage of artillery and blew him to bits, just made him explode. I became aware because after saying, what the hell was that to my captain, then I noticed a bright glow on the instrument panel on my left side where our wingman was flying. I looked over to the left in time to see him exploding and burning to cinders and falling out of the sky, gradually falling down out of sight, starting off as a fireball because our helicopters were created out of magnesium alloy. Think of fireworks. That's what our helicopters were made of. They're really hard to ignite, but once they ignite, that whole helicopter turns to ash on the ground in 15 seconds. In the air, flying at 100 knots, full of 115, 145 purple, the highest octane fuel you could get, that whole aircraft disappeared in 10 seconds and incinerated 5 guys to death, from being alive to dead in 10 seconds. 2 of them were found on the ground later. We don't know if they jumped or were blown out by the explosion. So those 2 guys fortunately didn't get incinerated, but the other 3 guys got incinerated. We had gunships following us behind us, and there's a report. There's a site called Papa Smoke, one word, papasmoke.org. It's the Marine Corps Helicopter Pilot Association. And the stories on there were gunships called Klondike were following us to give us gun suppression if we needed it. And they observed the H-34 being shot down by friendly artillery. And they said the artillery seemed to have impacted right in the cockpit. So those 2 guys in the cockpit died instantly. One of them was a flight school classmate of mine. One of them I just met. And he was on loan from another squadron, TDY. He shouldn't even have been there. And the 2 crew, the crew chief and the gunner. And they had a corpsman on board. So one of the crews and the corpsman were found dead on the ground later. But the other 3 were never recovered. They probably were incinerated to nothing. So right there, those 2 incidents are why I have a bad case of post-traumatic stress, being in such a harrowing condition and watching my friends die and coming so incredibly close to death myself that I could not settle down. I could not commit. I could not stay in one place for years, decades, literally decades after Vietnam. Fortunately, I found a really wonderful woman, and she had a degree in psychology, and she was very much a people person. And she could tell that I needed help, and she encouraged me in a very loving, very caring, very carefully. She didn't jump up and say, hey, Bill, you're all fucked up. You need help. Get some help, or I'm going to dump you. That had happened to me before, regularly. But she very carefully and gently nudged me into thinking I might need help. So it was my idea. And so I started looking for help. And that's, to make a long story short, that's when I found the VA had free counseling. That's what I got into group counseling. Made an enormous difference in my life. And 3 or 4 years later, I actually ended up at her demand, actually, because we were almost ready to get married at that point. And then she threw me out because I was so dysfunctional. But that put me in the National Center for Post-Traumatic Stress in Menlo Park, California for 6 months. I spent in the psych hospital. And that changed my life. I got out of that thing and I got a really good job. And from that, I jumped to a much better job. And at 8 years between then and the time I retired, I made enough money to retire when I turned 65. So, boy, do I owe that young lady. Do I owe my young lady a big kiss and a hug every day? And does she get it every day? Yes, she does. Thank you, Carlita. I should show a picture of her if I had one. Anyway, she's a sweetheart. She saved my life. And what else happened? Oh, how are we doing for time, bud?
Oh, we're good, Key. You've got plenty of time. Plenty of time.
Okay, another good story. One night before I left, when I was still when I just got with 363 at Keokee by July, I was doing night medevac or night search and rescue, and we would sit by the airport at Chulai in case any of the airplane pilots going out on night bombing missions should need some help. Usually it was very routine. Usually we didn't get called out. We didn't do anything. We just sat there all night and slept or write letters or ate sea rations, and then went home in the morning. Someone else would take over the day shift. Well, this night we got a call from the tower, said, man your helicopters. Okay, so we went out and jumped on our helicopters and started them up, and then we started listening and talking to the tower. We're sitting there for probably 45 minutes listening. What had happened is a A4 pilot had taken off, and for some reason his gear would not retract. And for some reason his gear would not extend. He could not get a safe gear indication either way. So finally, they called up. Now, we're listening to all this on the radio. They called up the commanding officer of his squadron. The commanding officer comes up, and the ops officer, and they come up to the tower. And they're talking to the guy. They say, well, have you tried this? I guess, oh, no, I didn't try that. I'll try that. So we tried that, and it didn't work. And they say, well, have you tried this? No, I haven't tried that. The guy was really incompetent. He didn't know his airplane at all. He didn't know any of his emergency procedures. We were pretty embarrassed for him. But it turns out, finally, he did a slow fly past the tower, and they could see his gear were mangled. It had been broken by something he had hit on takeoff. So he couldn't put them up, he couldn't put them down. And he kept saying, well, I don't want to have to jump out of this thing, but right now, well, it looks like I guess I'm going to have to. So we figured out he was flying an A4, which is a small fighter bomber, and a really good machine called a scooter. And he's going to have to eject. But he doesn't want to eject over the base because there was a strong wind off the ocean. And if he ejected over the base, he would blow inland and probably land either in a minefield or in enemy territory. So, okay, ejecting over the base isn't going to work. So he's going to have to fly out to sea, eject over the ocean, and then we'll pick him up out of the water. Maybe he'll blow back to the base, but probably we'll have to pick him up out of the water. So we record in now, we're talking to the Air Force guy, and he says, okay, he's above a cloud level, but we're flying beneath him and maybe a mile away. And we see the flash from when he punches out of his A4. And he left his A4 flying east. He's probably still flying east out there somewhere. And we finally see him. He comes down through the clouds and he lands in the water. We see him. So we hover up to him. And he didn't have any flares, which again was being ill prepared for his mission. But he did have one of those single cell flashlights. And he had that attached to his shoulder so we could see his light. So we were able to find him. Again, I was flying co-pilot for this guy named Timothy O'Toole. Tim O'Toole is one of the best pilots ever. I was in several scrapes with him, and he got me through every time. Love the guy still. So he hovered down over the guy, but we're having a severe tropical storm. We got swells of 20 feet or more raking the coastline, and this guy's out floating around. He's bobbing up and down on these great big waves. And Tim is trying to get the cable to him with the horse collar so he could grab it around his shoulders and hold onto it. We could hoist him up. But he wasn't able to get to it. Every time I'd get close to him, the wind would blow it away. or he'd get on top of a wave and he'd fall down the side of the wave and the horse collar wouldn't get to him. We flew around for probably 20 minutes trying to rescue this guy. Finally, Tim says, we're not supposed to have, Tim's not in this picture. So Tim said, we're not supposed to drive our machines for more than 5 minutes at full military power. So I throttled back to low power and took off, and we flew around in a big circle and says, okay, now back to military power. So it's kind of a token gift towards taking care of the engine. So then we found the guy, and he's got the horse collar down to him. He's still trying to get hold of it. The waves are still blowing him away. The wind is still blowing the horse collar away. Tim is so intent on getting the horse collar to the guy, he kept going lower and lower and lower and lower. He got down between the troughs of the big waves, and when nobody knew it. I'm saying, my job as co-pilot is simply to watch the instruments, make sure that Tim doesn't destroy the engine, or to see if the engine is having any problems like oil pressure or oil temperature. But out of the corner of my eye, I see a little motion, and I look out to my left, and I see this giant wave, and it's right for us at my eye level. And I just grabbed the collective pitch, and I pulled up on it, and we leaped up about 20 feet, and that wave kissed our tires as it passed under us. Had it not jerked up on the collective, that wave would have smashed us out of the air like hitting a fly with a fly swatter, and I'm sure all of us would have perished. 2 pilots, 2 crew, and a corpsman on board would have all died also because we had heavy boots on. We had, who knows what the crash would have done to us. I believe we had Medevac on, but who knows if we'd had the ability or the time to use them. So by jerking up on the collective, I saved all of our lives. And after that, Tim was able to get the horse collar to the guy in the water, and we picked him up and brought him back to the base. So that was our rescue. That was an exciting rescue that my friend Timothy O'Toole did, and I was the assistant. So that was another time I almost died in Vietnam. But most of the time, yes, our stuff was just routine hauling supplies and ammunition to the troops in the field. See, I had another mission. Oh yeah, another mission up near Khe Sanh. It was fun to go to Khe Sanh actually because it was very challenging flying. One time I was out somewhere, I don't remember where, and we landed in the landing zone. And again, I was flying co-pilot for, there's some Khe Sanh. And I landed in this landing zone, and we're sitting there waiting for the grunts to load some wounded guys. First, we have to unload the cargo. That takes about 3 seconds because the crew chief just pushes it out with his feet or dumps it out. And then they're loading wounded, and the enemy started marching mortars in on us. And the radio operator said, "They're marching mortars in on you." I said, "Oh no, we got to get out of here." I'm flying co-pilot, but I can communicate to Tim that I think we should get the hell out of here. I'm rolling up the throttle to maximum throttle, and I'm pulling up the collective till the helicopter's dancing on its tire tips, but we're not flying yet, not hovering yet. And Tim very calmly, very smoothly just reaches over and puts the collective down and pushes it down and rolls the throttle back. He didn't want to hover yet because we're still loading wounded. The mortars are marching in on us. I can hear them, and they're getting closer and closer and louder and louder and closer and louder. I think I heard about 4. The last one was so close, I thought the next one's going to be right on top of us. Once again, I brought the motor up to maximum power and the RPM up to till the helicopter was dancing on its tire tips. And Tim very calmly pushed the collective down and rolled the throttle up because we still needed to load a couple more wounded. Damn, Tim, you're going to get us killed. We got the wounded on board and we pulled pitch and we got that. The only thing reason we didn't get killed, I think, in that case is I think the enemy ran out of mortars. They marched in on us. They expended 4 or 5 getting to range. The next one should have been right on top of us, and it didn't happen. I think they just didn't have any more. Some poor son of a bitch out there who carried that 6 or 8 mortars all the way from Vietnam, North Vietnam, down to our battle zone, he probably said, "Shit, should have carried 1 more." But he didn't. Another fun thing that used to happen was I heard this from the Army version, and I heard it from the Marine Corps version too. The North Vietnamese were trained that when they saw a helicopter to lead it, like when you're hunting, you shoot in front of the pheasant or the quail because they fly into your shot as you shoot them. The North Vietnamese were trained to lead a helicopter when they saw it. There's 2 stories I heard. where a helicopter was sitting on the ground, loading or unloading or whatever they were doing in an LZ, and a North Vietnamese soldier stepped out of the bushes, pulled his rifle on, took an absolute bead on the right side pilot, which in H-34 was the aircraft commander, and really both pilots because we were lined up. And then instead of pulling the trigger, he then moved the barrel of the rifle about 10 degrees in front of us. So he was taught to lead us. He was going to lead us. He would shoot, or before he could correct, and our gunner on the helicopter shot him dead, so he couldn't shoot anymore. So if he hadn't been so well trained, he would have not died. That happened occasionally.
God almighty.
What else? Oh my goodness.
How about your story about how you got your when you were on the ground, how you got your call sign? Was it Black Patch 14 or?
Yeah. Well, when we've been in the Philippines, and then I volunteered to be the forward air controller. About the same time, I got a bad patch of conjunctivitis, and I had to wear a black patch over my eye. So when I went in the field, my official call sign was Go Lemon 14. But one of my squadron mates suggested, hey, Bill, you ought to call yourself Black Patch, then we'll know it's you. So I did. So when I was Black Patch, all my squadron mates knew that I was the guy they were working with. And that was fun. Oh, by the follow-up on the, when we did the big airstrike on the follow-up in Quang Nai, there's Black Patch in my half-away shirt. When we did the assault for the time when I was on the ground, our entire helicopter squadron was loaded with troops, and we were flying an entire battalion into this huge rice paddy. And the military had prepared the rice paddy. They had sent in bombers and napalm and naval warfare, naval artillery, and rocket artillery, and they had just pasted the hell out of the landing zone to make sure there were no enemies there. If there were there, they were dead. Unfortunately, in the combat battle and all the confusion that was going on, our commanding officer landed in the wrong rice paddy. He landed the whole squadron in the wrong rice paddy, and guess what? The enemy was there, and they shot us full of holes. Every 12 out of 13 of our helicopters went back to the ship streaming some kind of fluid, hydraulic fluid, oil, gasoline, and or blood. Fortunately, the most seriously wounded guy was only mildly wounded, and our commanding officer got shot in his Achilles tendon. It destroyed his Achilles tendon. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life. But that was the most serious wound during that fiasco, but it could have been a whole lot worse. And I'm so glad not to be there. Oh my God. I think if I'd been there, I'd have been maybe co-pilot for that guy. You never know. But no one else was wounded, actually, just him. But all of our helicopters were out of service at that point, except one.
One of our
quite a show.
One of our SOGmen had a question. The King Bees leaked hydraulic fluid like mad, and he was curious, did the Marine H-34s leak hydraulic fluid like our King Bees did?
We did not leak hydraulic tube, little drips here and there, but basically it was a high pressure system. It really had to be well tightly sealed. We did drip oil, and we used a gallon of oil every hour in the engine. And I think the biggest messy thing we had with our helicopters, we had about 100 grease fittings on the rotor head. So every day, the crew chief had to grease all those rotor fittings, and there was always a little grease left over. So whenever we spun up the rotor, it would start throwing little bits of grease. And the whole tail section of the helicopter always had hundreds of little greasy spots on it because of the grease we threw from the rotor system. Now, there was a big machine called the H-37. You probably have that picture, Bud. The big giant helicopter with the open clamshell doors. That one was famous for leaking hydraulic fluid to the point where the crew chief would have a 5-gallon, I think a 3-gallon can tied up above the cargo space beneath the transmission, and it would catch all the fluid that leaked out of the transmission while the helicopter was flying. And then every time they shut down, they'd climb up on top and put the fluid back in the transmission. Recycled it. It was a mess.
Wow. Yeah. Here's
Yeah, there it is. That big beast. That was it looks impressive, but it's really not, because it
no.
had the two great big giant 18-cylinder radial engines. It was initially designed to have turbine engines, but they had a bunch of these old war surplus 18-cylinder recips. So they decided to put those into this machine. And they were lots of power, but they added a lot of weight, because they were probably 2,500 pounds a piece, maybe heavier. My engine in my H-34 was 1,500 pounds. So the big old H-37, it was called, that one is called the, I think that was called the Choctaw. H-34 was called the Choctaw in the Army. Mojave, it was called the Mojave. And there were only 4 in Vietnam. The Marine Corps had 4 of them. And they just used them for transport. They didn't really use them for assaults or inserting troops or anything. Mostly just carried people and stuff from A to B, B to C. One did get destroyed. It landed near the bottom of the rock pile and got hit by a mortar and was destroyed in combat. It was written off, but it wasn't, nobody was hurt. Again, if you go to the Papa Smoke, www.papasmoke, one word, .org, you can read a million stories about all the stuff the Marines did. And there's thousands of pictures. There's my picture of approaching the rock pile.
Can you talk a little bit? There's 2 things about excuse me, landing on things. Could you talk a little bit about what it was like landing and coming into the rock pile?
Yeah, it was a bit tight. It was a bit challenging. It was what they call a pinnacle approach. And here, really a pinnacle approach should be a little steeper, but I like to come in more flat. And that's not me, by the way. I took that picture, though, in the same machine. And there's the second picture. And when I first got there, that platform did not exist. The grunts had climbed up there. Maybe they were probably inserted by helicopter, actually. And they scraped everything off. And I have pictures where the guys used to come in and land with one wheel, and semi-hover with one wheel on the ground. And they could unload troops, load troops, unload supplies, load medevacs, wounded, whatever. And eventually, finally, the troops scraped off that little hill there, and they made it about 5 by 20. So then we could hover in there. We could land with our 2 wheels on that kind of a sidewalk situation, but the tail would be hovering, floating out over space. So when someone got off or we offloaded something, we had to reduce power because the helicopter would want to take off. If someone got on, 2 or 3 guys got on, we'd have to add power to keep from falling over backwards. So it was pretty dicey to land there. And then along came the guy that built the platform. It made it much easier. We could put all 3 wheels down solidly on there. It was a very solid platform. And here's a funny story. I was in a bar one night right after I published my book. I was in a bar and somebody asked me about how it was going. And we started talking about it. And the guy down the bar came over and said, "Hey, I was a Marine. I lived down on top of the rock pile. I helped build that platform." So I met the guy who helped build that platform.
Wow.
And he lived up there in the rock pile and he had a really funny story. I'll tell his story. He was up there one night, and they felt they were really safe because it was sheer sides, just sheer limestone. It would be really hard for the enemy to climb up the side. So they assumed the enemy couldn't. And I'm sure they had guards out overnight, but one night he was sleeping, laying on his rubber lady in a sleeping bag, and he became aware that someone was walking around by his feet. And he looked up and he saw an NVA soldier. Oh shit, he don't want to disturb the guy because the guy would probably shoot him. So he played like he was asleep. And the enemy soldier was just looking for food. He was hungry. So he sniffed around and he stole what he thought was food. And he took back down to his troops, down to his base. He took a big block of C4 explosive. So it looks like cheese. He thought he had found cheese maybe. And he stole it and ran away with it. But he didn't hurt anybody. All he did was steal the explosive. So who knows what happened when he got back to his base with that stuff. You could burn it. It would burn really hot and it wouldn't explode. But if
Okay.
you set it off at all, like if you shot it or pounded it with a hammer, it would explode. It took a exploding device to make it start usually,
Mm-hmm.
but if it was impacted hard, it would blow up by itself. But you could tear off a piece and burn it. We used it to heat our sea rations
Mm-hmm.
in a pot
We've heard
and
numerous
lids
tales
because
of that. That's wild that y'all would do stuff like that.
first time I saw it, I was totally appalled. I thought, oh my God, that guy's going to burn it and blow us all up. He says, no, no, this just makes good intense heat for cooking your food. Yeah, it was true. Yeah.
Wow.
So
And another interesting and then there's a few questions we'll get to. And I don't want to give too much away. We'll cover a few pictures because you have told some good stories and I don't want to give away everything. But could you talk about because we recently had a Seawolf veteran on who flew for the Navy, stood up the unit in the Navy, in Vietnam, disbanded in Vietnam, and they were landing on converted LSTs, and y'all were actually landing on the USS Iwo Jima. Could you speak a little bit about what it was like landing an H-34 on a WW2 era? I guess it's what is it? Is it an old aircraft carrier or was it a
yeah,
troop transport?
it was what they called a Jeep carrier. A
Okay.
lot of small carriers were built. We had 100 aircraft carriers by the time World War II was over. And they were built basically to transport aircraft from the States to the war zones. So they'd fill them up with aircraft and drive them over there and offload them by cranes. And when they got enough room, they could actually fly them off. And so they were perfect for being a helicopter landing zone because they were small. They had enough room for, I think our squadron only had 12 or 13 helicopters. And they had the big elevators, which would take the helicopters down below to the hangar deck where they could be stored and repaired and cleaned or whatever. So, yeah, this is not my picture, but it's a good one. Maybe it is my picture. I don't remember this one. But yeah, it was actually landing aboard the carrier. I never had to do it in the dark, and I never had to do it in bad weather. So it was basically just hovering up to it and hovering down and landing. So it was really quite easy.
Wow.
The
And
only
would y'all have
the
to
only
land
time,
at night occasionally though? Would guys have
oh yeah,
to?
yeah, sometimes. One time we were doing the time we were when I left Fubai going to Okinawa, I think we're on the Princeton, and we were doing just for practice for training. We did night carrier qualifications, and the whole squadron was out flying circles around the South China Sea on the way to Taiwan. And somehow I didn't get selected to fly that night, and I was off. So I took my camera up and I laid in the catwalk and I took time-elapsed photos of the helicopters landing on the deck. Can you spool those up at all? Do you have those?
I don't have
Mhm.
that one taken from the book, but I do have a picture of the uh, Princeton aircraft carrier to pull up. I didn't want to share all of your great photos from your book, but there's the Princeton right there with looks like some Hueys on it already.
Yeah, looks like it might be 46s actually. Hard to tell. No, it's not 46s. Ah, almost 34s. Hard to tell.
Yeah, I
Anyway, we
can't
could tell the
quite tell.
difference between the Iwo Jima and the Princetons because the Iwo Jima had a white deck that made it easier to see at night.
Wow, wow,
Yeah, and then
wow.
one time I was flying with a flying co-pilot again for a guy named Michael Hines, and we had wounded aboard, and we're trying to get back to the ship to take him to the hospital on the ship. And when we got out there, the ship was offshore. It was in a fog bank. All we could see was the mast of the ship sticking up out of the fog. It was a layer of fog right, and just the mast cutting through the fog. And we had these wounded guys. We wanted to get them aboard the ship as soon as we could. And the ship was not even at flight quarters, which is supposed to be before you can land. So Mike did a very clever thing. You could see the direction the ship was going, and we circled around and came back, and we kept descending until we came down, and we had a radar altimeter which would tell us our height above the water. So we came down about 100 feet, and about 70 feet, we could see the water, and we could see the wake of the ship. So we hover taxied over the water up until we could see the ship above us. and we just hopped up and landed on the ship and taxied and hovered up and right where they take where the hospital corpsman would take the wounded off the helicopter. The Navy captain was not happy that we landed on the ship without permission. And when it was not at flight quarters, but we didn't care because we wanted those Marines to get help. So that was an
Absolutely.
interesting experience. Mike was very clever.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's give let a Marine have a problem, and he'll find a way to fix it one way or the other.
that's
Um,
right. Improvise and overcome.
Absolutely. Could you're and one thing I really enjoy about your book, really, it's pretty much each chapter that involves when you're not say in the field, which is one of my favorite chapters because you're really in it. All of the book is great, but you give let's see, their little stats for the entire unit. Let's see if I can find one that it lists the total number of wounded Marines pulled out, the tonnage or weight of supplies and cargo moved out, total number of passengers. Like here, September of 1966, HMM 161 flew a total of 1,460.9 hours, carried 3,284 passengers, 320.2 tons of cargo, and flew 782 medvacs, changed 6 engines, and it says Captain Collier flew personally 64 hours that month of September of 66. And you do that throughout the book, which is another reason I find it, because it shows how much work y'all are doing, not just like you said in the bush getting Marines out, but also getting supplies places, ammunition places, I think mortars, cannons, and such as that. What? How much aircraft were y'all going through at this point in time?
We really lost very few aircraft.
Wow.
It was amazing. Yeah. Usually, if something went wrong, we left them in the field. We had there's one after Lieutenant Stroop hit a telephone wire at night, and he was the second aircraft down next to the first aircraft.
Yes, sir.
The first aircraft got knocked down by hitting a guy wire on an antenna. But then Stroop went in to be the search and rescue to rescue his squadron mates, and he hit a telephone wire. And so we had 2 helicopters stacked up in the rice paddies side by side each other, and nobody was hurt. And you can see the guys on the street there, but that's the guys doing the recovery. So at night, they were trying to do a night medevac, and they were flying around, and that little village to the top part of the picture was a Popular Forces encampment, which was in the middle of the DMZ. And Mike was flying north trying to find some medevacs, and he realized he probably had stumbled into or very close to North Vietnam, so he decided to turn around and head south. And that's when he hit the radio antenna that belonged to that Special Forces camp. And he flew that far, maybe 1/8 of a mile before he crashed. And the wire hit his first blade, and it curled it up like that over his head, over the head of the rotor system. The second blade missed the wire. The third blade hit something else and stripped all of the lifting pockets off of the blade. So there was nothing left but the spar. And the fourth blade missed. And then something chopped off the tail of the helicopter. So he's got 2 of his 4 blades are out of commission, and his tail is dangling by control cables. Fortunately, all he did, he just said, holy shit, and he just added as much power as he could land. Fortunately, he landed on all 3 tires and made a good landing without 2 blades and without his tail. That's a different tale at a different story.
Oh, wow.
That's
Okay.
it, case on.
Oh, God.
But so now then Lieutenant Stroop came in to rescue the crew of the first helicopter. He hit the telephone wire, crashed beside Michael Hines. And now we have 9 guys in the field, in the dark, in a bad storm, in heavy rain, and they think they're in North Vietnam. They don't know where they are. So Hines was from Boston. And so he gathered all the troops up and they found a burial mound. The Vietnamese bury their people in big round mounds. And the only place they could find high ground was one of these burial mounds. Other than that, they're knee deep in water. And they managed to recover all 4 of the machine guns from both helicopters. They didn't get any ammunition. They had 4 machine guns and no bullets. So the only armament they had was each pilot had a 38 caliber pistol and maybe 5 rounds. That was the entire armament that they had for 9 guys to defend themselves from the North Vietnamese. So they created a post situation, I don't know what you call it, on this burial mound, and waiting now. And I think one of them got a radio call out somehow. And the scary part for me was Mike Hines was married to a woman who was the sister of a young woman who was married to my good friend Timothy O'Toole. Timothy O'Toole's stepbrother or brother-in-law was out there in the field. And as soon as we got a radio call that they were down, Tim wanted to go get a helicopter and go take every chance to rescue his brother-in-law. So the only thing he thought he could possibly think about was rescuing his brother-in-law. So I'm with Tim for the day. I'll be his co-pilot if we go back out. I don't want to go because we just lost 2 helicopters. We don't know why yet. They could have been shot down. They could have run into each other. They could all be dead. And it's really shitty weather. And the ceiling's about 150 feet. It's raining like hell. I don't want to go, but I can't say no. I can make a poem out of that, bro. So, so fortunately, just before we got a helicopter and went looking for our guys, we got a radio call that they were all safe and they were in the Popular Forces compound and we could pick them up the next day. Cool. Yeah, no kidding. I did not want to go out and all that shit. So, but getting back to the former story, which was an offshoot of this, whenever we lost a helicopter, we could usually recover them. And so the big helicopters would come in. Actually, they could take the engine out and the tail off, and our own H-34 could pick up the rest of an H-34 and the tail and the motor separately, each one. So we could recover our own helicopter. But the H-46 could also lift an H-34. And the Army often brought in the flying sky crane. And they would lift our helicopters out of the woods and bring them home. They would get repaired and put back in service or cannibalized and take the good parts out to repair good helicopters. So, but there are, you've seen the picture in the book of the shadow-looking thing of the ashes on the beach of an H-34 that burned. Can you find that picture? Anyway, it would burn to ashes in 15 seconds and just leave lumps. The 2 lumps would be the transmission, the motor, and the rotor tips. And usually the tail would not burn up; it would just fall away. But it would happen fast. And we used to kid that we could navigate around North Vietnam by the burned up helicopters all over the ground. But I really actually saw very many. They would burn up fast. A good friend of mine named Paul Gregoire, and this story's in the book. It's called A Borrowed Story. My friend Paul was flying along somewhere near Keokee, Chulai, and he got laced by tracers. He was about 2,200 feet. And his crew chief radioed up and said, "We're on fire, sir." And Paul says to him, immediately starts an auto rotation to get to the ground as fast as he can. "Use the fire extinguisher." And the crew chief comes up and says, "Already have, sir. Fire's still burning." Oh, crap. So Paul is falling out of the sky about 5,000 feet a minute, and he's only starting at 2,200 feet. Okay, so he's coming down fast. The ground is coming up fast. And the fire's so bad in the cargo cabin that the crew chief climbs out onto the tire and is standing on the tire, holding onto the strut so he can be away from the fire. The poor bastard of a gunner in the back, he can't get out. He's trapped. The fire is burning bigger, but the helicopter was full of boxes of ammunition. This guy stacks boxes of live ammunition between him and the fire to protect himself, and he gets backed into the tail cone of the helicopter. There is no way out. He's going to be incinerated, but he's making himself a few more seconds to live. So Paul, and then by this time, all of the smoke grenades have ignited. And all the different colors of smoke are coming out of the helicopter, red and green and purple and yellow and white. and not to mention the oil from the engine and whatever else is burning. It is a mess falling out of the sky. And Paul's coming down so fast that the pilot's windows are open, and so the air is getting sucked out of the belly into the cockpit, and Paul can't see because it's so smoky. So he kicks the helicopter sideways to blow the smoke out of the cockpit, and about that time he impacts the ground. He was in this high rate of speed. The helicopter bounces and crunches, throws the crew chief off of the strut and throws him off into the rice paddy uninjured. And the helicopter was so weakened by the fire, by now the tail breaks off and pours the gunner out like pouring the yolk out of an egg. And he escapes unscathed. Can you believe it? And then Paul's in shock. He's sitting in a cockpit. His helicopter's burning around him. He's just sitting there in shock, and he doesn't think even about saving himself. His co-pilot jumps out, climbs down his side, runs around to Paul's side, climbs up Paul's side, and gets Paul unstrapped and gets him out of the helicopter. So that was one of the diciest missions I ever heard. And I just saw my friend Paul last fall, so I got to rehear that story. That was an amazing story.
That is pucker factor inducing, to say the least.
He actually, from that extremely hard landing, he got compressive spine injuries, and he is having trouble walking, and he is on a walker these days, 100% disabled on a walker because of that injury. But he's still working, still happy, living with his daughter, doing well, somewhere in North Carolina.
Thank goodness. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, me too.
Let's see. We did have, let me see if we had a question or two real quick. Yep, Mary Jo has one. She says she enjoyed your books. She found it interesting, your suppressive experience of the startle reflex. Could this have been an aspect of your later restlessness, moving often because you couldn't move?
I don't think there's a direct correlation. I think it was post-traumatic stress was more the restlessness and the moving around. The startle reflex was just, I had to suppress it because I was sitting in a cockpit. I couldn't shoot back. I couldn't jump out. I couldn't jump in a foxhole. I couldn't take any action. Most of the time I was co-pilot. I couldn't even fly the helicopter. So
just there for the ride.
When I had the thing where the artillery shot down my wingman, I really had the impulse to jump out of the helicopter. But, I didn't do it because I knew it was at 4,000 feet above the ground, and it would do no good to jump out at that point. I was afraid that since the enemy, I thought it was the enemy had shot us down, my wingman. And I thought, well, if they can shoot him down, pretty soon they're going to shoot us down. That's where my panic came in. I thought, oh my God, the enemy has this handheld heat-seeking missile now that it didn't have till later. I thought of that. That's what later became the Strela missile. I actually thought of that in late '66. I thought, wow, if the enemy just had a small handheld heat-seeking missile, much like our Sidewinder missile that the jet pilots had to shoot down other planes. If the enemy could have that, they'd shoot our helicopters out of the sky every day, all day. This war would be over. We'd have to leave. But it did happen. They eventually did come up with that. But then we came up with countermeasures of shooting flares to attract these Strela missiles to the heat of the flares rather than to the turbines of the helicopters. And I guess that was pretty effective. I've never heard of any. One H-34 C Stallion got shot down, but it still had one engine and was able to fly down. It didn't get blown up or fall out of the sky.
Wow. The Strela will come up when we talk about Air America.
With Air America was the main reason I quit Air America.
Yeah, I was about to say
that enemy came up with the handheld heat-seeking missile there in 1972.
Plays a pivotal part in your Air America story. But I mean, not only speaking of the Strela, but you actually came quite up close and personal with a surface-to-air missile and seeing its effects.
Yes, they did. Yeah.
Could you speak a little bit about what that was like, seeing, how close you were? Sure. You were flying. Right there.
No, I was not flying, actually. I was sitting in the bar.
Oh
We
God.
had just moved to Donha, and our bar at that point was nothing more than a plywood platform about 16 by 24. It was just a deck. And a bunch of us were sitting out in our lawn chairs. Everybody had a lawn chair. We're sitting out there drinking beer and rehashing and sharing our stories. I learned a lot from the other guys over beers at night, especially in the club, because they would share what they did, techniques they had created or discovered. And I used those techniques many, many times. Anyway, we're sitting out in this patio, so to speak, and we see two A4s go by overhead. They're headed north, probably out of Penang, and they just fly over us. We could tell by the sound. We knew the different noises from the different engines that these were A4s. And theoretically, I guess they weren't allowed to go into North Vietnam. So when they got up near the DMZ, they did a U-turn. But they did the U-turn by turning away from each other, sort of a double U. I describe it as describing a scrotum in the sky, because it's these two asymmetrical loops parallel to each other. And as soon as they turned their tail to the North Vietnamese shot Strela missiles at them. So we sat there and watched the not the Strela, these were SAMs. These are serious, powerful missiles, like they were shooting at the airplanes up north.
Mm-hmm.
And we watched the missiles streak up, and one missed and one hit one of the A4s and blew them out of the sky. And after hitting, there was a second explosion. We thought, well, that pilot's dead. That second explosion was probably the aircraft blowing up. Well, we found out, and so we made a toast. And somebody said we should have a toast to the toasted pilot. So we made a toast to the toasted pilot, drank a drink to him. Could have been any one of us up there, because we could have gone jets instead of helicopters when we finished flight school. So what we found out the next day, one of our squadron mates was out flying in the area where the A4 was shot down, and he heard the radio, emergency radio. The pilot, the second flash, what we thought was the aircraft blowing up, was actually his ejection seat. He ejected, he got to the ground, he lived, he hid in the bushes until he heard our helicopter nearby, called for help, and one of our helicopters went over and rescued him. So that was a good story. Later that same day, I was tasked with going out and recovering the remains of the missile. And it was just a big round metal tube about 8 feet long with both ends blown off. But, the intelligence people wanted that missile, so we got it for them. And that was non-eventful too. That's a picture of that in my book too. It's a blurry picture. Somehow my camera was out of focus when I took that picture. It's a terrible picture, but it does show the missile.
That is amazing. That's just too cool. I mean, thank goodness he survived that, because there y'all are toasting him and honoring him at his death, and thank God that
I'm so glad to hear he's alive.
Woo,
Like
wow.
I said, it could be any one of us.
Absolutely. We're coming up on an hour and a half here.
Wow. Okay.
Did you have any stories or anything in particular you'd like to close out with today? Because we're gonna be getting into the weeds here. Considering we haven't had an Air America pilot on for the 30th, so we're gonna be getting into it that day. But is there anything you'd like to share or go out with for this afternoon?
I'd like to plug my website, 1% for Peace. one%.for.peace.com. Having seen war up close and personal, I'm trying to put together this thing that, what if we spent 1% of our military budget on creating peace? It would be a minuscule amount of the military budget. And if the military wanted to increase their budget by that 1% to make up for the loss, they could do that. But then we just get a slightly bigger bit. Do you realize 1% of our current military budget is $100 million every hour? Think about that. What could we do with $100 million to create peace? What if we did advertising? What if we had poster contests? What if we educated kids that war is not the way to go? Educate people how to communicate, how to collaborate and how to not fight instead. I mean, there's a million ways you can think of. My pet idea is, what if we funded and the military industrial complex could build a small fleet of small Jeep carriers outfitted with a helicopter squadron, and we had about 12 of these all over the world, and we could then send them, they'd be on station in 24 hours, any major disaster anywhere in the world, and 2 or 3 would be there within 3 or 4 days or a week. We could do a lot of good in the world, saving people's lives, bringing water, bringing food, bringing generators, bringing shelter, and helping people instead of spending all that damn money on friggin' war, okay? My war experience has made me very anti-war. And I came up with this idea, why don't we spend 1% of our military budget for peace? Remember Dennis Kucinich, when he ran for president, he had the idea of having a secretary of peace on the president's cabinet. He didn't see how he was going to fund it, but I know how to fund it. So anyway, if you look at that, everybody, if you feel like you want to send a donation, please do. I take Venmo, PayPal, and another one. So it's on the site.
Wow.
Trees, something like that.
I will add that into the show notes. I did not even know about that, or I would have already had that plugged in, but I will plug that in here.
Okay, thank you, bud.
When we end up. That's amazing. I'm glad to hear, and that's what we need. We've got veterans in politics, but sadly, some of them seem to be getting jaded by money and wanting to be bought off by the military industrial complex, which you just mentioned.
I think our whole government has been. We've got to change that.
Absolutely. And those of you that have fought in war, y'all know it. There's really no winners in war,
Well, if I may, just one more short one here. Just before I get out of the Marine Corps, I think I mentioned earlier, I went to nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare school. I'm a certified expert on NBC. There was no way, from my knowledge, Saddam Hussein could have had nuclear weapons.
No.
That whole war was based on lies.
Total BS.
Military-industrial complex gambit is all it was. So, anyway, that's my piece. I'm done.
I could not agree with you more. That George W. Bush was mad because he tried to kill his dad, 13 years earlier, and
just frat boy stuff.
Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, don't even get me started on that. I'm not a big fan of any of our politicians, to be quite frank with you. That's I didn't want to give away a lot for people that are going to end up buying your book, because we're almost up to 5,000 subscribers, and people are already saying they're wanting you to come back. So we've already got you scheduled for Tuesday the 30th, which we're going to be talking about Air America, which is going to be covering a lot of stuff that day. We're going to be going long that day. But we may have to, after we cover Air America on the 30th, in May sometime, we may have to have you back to come talk about flying the Marines some more, because I feel like
I could do that.
After we get some people to buy some books and everything, once they read it, they'll want to hear your thoughts on some more, maybe ask some questions. So I think that would be nice to have you back.
Questions about it. Very good.
Absolutely. All righty, guys. Well, I appreciate you guys watching. I know Mr. Bill appreciates it. Again, this episode is based on this book right here. Both are on Amazon. They're in the show notes. And the Tuesday the 30th at 3 p.m. Central Standard Time, we'll be covering this book, which is his time flying in Laos, flying helicopters for Air America. And it's going to be outstanding. I'm very much looking forward to that. So you guys have a wonderful, wonderful evening. And we will plan on seeing y'all the 30th again. So you guys be good and have a wonderful evening. And Mr. Bill, just stick around and I'll end this up and we'll close it out.